What Newman provides in the grammar is, we would now say, an essay in epistemology, which is to say, an essay in the theory of knowledge, an analysis of what it is to know something, and how it is that knowledge is arrived at and maintained. Newman does not use, so far as I am aware, the word epistemology. That was a new coinage in the second half of the 19th century. The Oxford English Dictionary's first recorded instance of its use is from 1856, and it is not a word Newman appears to have embraced. The theory of knowledge is, nevertheless, what he was concerned with in the grammar, and this means, among many other things, that the question of the truth of Catholic doctrine is not the question of this book, of the grammar. This is important to bear in mind. Of course, Newman thinks Catholic doctrine true, but its truth is not his topic in the grammar. He wants instead to develop, and perhaps to persuade others to accept, an account of what it is to assent, and to come to assent, that shows assent to Catholic doctrine not to be different in kind, in most respects anyway, from assent to other kinds of claims, and therefore not to be capable of being dismissed out of hand, as the intellectual elites of his time, as of ours, were often happy to do. Now, if your eyes are already beginning to glaze over, you are not alone. The grammar is, I rather suspect, among the least read works of Newman's Catholic period. And this is for two principal reasons. The first is that it addresses a highly abstract topic of interest to only a very small proportion of human beings, then and now. Most of us do not worry about how we come to assent to what we assent to, much less do we want to read analyses of that matter. The second reason for the lack of attention paid to the grammar is that its topic was not one of central concern to the Catholic intellectual tradition of his time, and was, it seems to me, largely incomprehensible to that world. Responses to the work following its publication and then on for the next 3/4 of a century or so generally show that the book is not understood. And they show this lack of understanding typically by criticizing it for not being something it was not trying to be. Some critics, for example, take the work to be a treatise in apologetics and to fail as such. Some try to assess it, especially after the Thomistic revival in the 1870s, some try to assess it in terms of a broadly Thomist metaphysic and theological anthropology, neither of which enterprises is at all helpful in understanding what Newman is up to. In fact, I should say that most Thomists are ill-equipped to comprehend Newman's enterprise in this book, because Thomism, in most of its forms, then and now, simply has no room for the questions that Newman is addressing. Even today, 140 years after the book's first publication, and in the year of its author's beatification, I should think that a very large proportion of those who open the book with the intention of reading it do not make it past the first 10 pages. And that is not because Newman's prose is forbidding or inelegant. It is never either. It is just because most of us are not good at abstraction and simply unconcerned with the topics addressed in the grammar. It is one of the great and interesting merits of the book that it shows that and why most of us do not need to have the interests it addresses in order to be perfectly justified in making the assents we make. Newman would have appreciated the paradox that the book's argument, if successful, shows that most people don't need to read it. I mean that very seriously, actually. The book, if it is successful, shows that it's an interest that most people don't need to have, and are quite justified in not having it. However, I certainly don't intend to discourage you from reading the grammar if you've not already done so. If you're interested in Newman, then certainly you should, for the book's topic was one of deep concern to him from at least the 1830s until his death. He wrote and preached about it as an Anglican. It surfaces in the Apologia, and his understanding of how it is that Catholic doctrine develops is intimately intertwined with his properly epistemological concerns. A good understanding of the grammar, then, illuminates much else about Newman's thought. And not only that, Newman was, in many ways, far ahead of his time in this book. And what he has to say about assenting to what the church teaches, and about assent in general, is still of great use to the church in its unavoidable conflicts with the culture despisers of our time. In fact, I rather think that we are only now beginning to see the uses of Newman's thought in this respect. His opponents were the materialists and idolaters of science of the 19th century, such men as Herbert Spencer. Ours are their early 21st century equivalents, such men as Richard Dawkins. Newman can, if we read him carefully, help us to see that while we should not expect to persuade such men of the truth of the Catholic faith, that is a task of the Holy Spirit after all, we can at least show them that assenting to what the Church teaches is not, in principle, irrational, and that the charge that it is irrational itself shows a commitment to an indefensible and incoherent theory of knowledge, and those are great goods. Now, in understanding Newman on assent, we'll do well to have some examples before us. I give you 3 on section 2 of your handout, 2A, 2B, 2C. This is going to sound a bit like a philosophy class, I'm afraid, but only for about 10 minutes. And I'm going to take my jacket off, if you'll forgive me, because this will be something of a workout. So. And we'll go no further than that. So, let's begin with 2A. The proposition that Great Britain is an island. This is one of Newman's own examples. I take it from chapter 8 of the Grammar. About this, Newman says, most Englishmen give, I quote, deliberate and unconditional adhesion, close quote, to it. Which is to say that Englishmen take the proposition to be true and do not stand in fear of its being falsified. I suppose that the same would be true of many Americans, though rather fewer of them are likely to have thought about it than is the case for the English. And a rather higher proportion of them, notably those without much in the way of geographical or historical education, might have no opinion about the matter. I find myself assenting to the proposition, certainly, in much the way that Newman suggests, though with some small reservations caused by such things as the Channel Tunnel, of course unknown to him. Now, the proposition that Great Britain is an island is not perhaps very interesting or exciting. Newman takes it as an example of a claim of whose truth we are all, or almost all, sure, but of whose truth we have no demonstrative proof. We believe it because we have been taught it at school, because we have looked at maps where it seems to be so, and because much in the fabric of everyday life in England suggests that you cannot get out of the country without crossing water. Some few of us may have ourselves circumnavigated the island in a boat, or looked down on it from orbit, and those who have done either of those things might assent to the claim for causes additional to the usual ones. But few of us have done those things, and yet we are still sure. We can have, if we think about it, what Newman calls certitude with respect to this claim, which is to say that we can not only assent to it, but also to the subsequent claim that we are sure about it, that our assent is, to use Newman's favoured technical term, indefectible, that we shall not change our minds in the future. Are there arguments that can be brought against the truth of the claim that Great Britain is an island? Yes, certainly. Perhaps we are all believing this, Newman says, I quote, on the credit of each other, close quote, while there is in fact some obscure land passage connecting Scotland to Norway yet to be discovered, or once known and now forgotten. These things, and many more fanciful, are certainly possible. There is no logical necessity to the truth of the claim that Great Britain is an island, which is to say that the world might be such that it is false. And, as noted, perhaps it is, in a sense, now false since the opening of the Channel Tunnel.